I'm somebody that I don't really buy into the rich need to pay their fair share. I mean, when you look at the statistics of where we actually get funding for the government, the top 10% of earners in this country, I think, pay about 90% of the money that goes into the federal treasury. I mean, Democrats always use these examples. I'm not saying they don't exist, okay? People have tax accountants and they figure out how to pay a little tax as they can. But a lot of times Democrats use this to talk about raising taxes in America. And I think one of the big issues in 2025, I was just asked about this on the radio, they said, what's the most urgent thing in 2025 that the new Republican president have to get done? And I said, you got to make the Trump-Pence tax cuts permanent, because they go away at the end of 2025.
This is Mike Pence admitting out loud, thanks to a video unearthed by the organization American Bridge, that he has no interest in making the rich pay their fair share in taxes, which, of course, we knew in theory, but it really is something to hear them say it out loud. Now, granted, Mike Pence was part of the administration whose biggest legislative accomplishment was giving trillions in huge tax handouts that skewed for the ultra-wealthy and corporations. Handouts that added massive amounts to the debt, only for Republicans to then turn around after Biden cut the deficit by the largest amount in history and, you guessed it, demand cuts in programs that help the working class. Because populism or something. So, of course, Mike Pence and every other Republican presidential candidate have no interest in making their donors actually pay their fair share. The entire business model of the GOP is to scapegoat minorities to benefit the rich and rob the working and middle class. They know how unpopular giving tax cuts to the rich is. For example, a Data for Progress poll in 2021 found that 71% of Americans support raising taxes on the wealthiest 2% of Americans. And so, given how unpopular their platform is, Republicans have no choice but to distract you to keep the focus elsewhere. Trump ran in 2016 on immigration and claimed he would build the wall and make Mexico pay for it. And instead of expending his political capital to actually bother trying to do that after taking office, he gave historic tax cuts for the rich because it was all a distraction to gin up his base while enriching himself and his donors. Distraction and self-enrichment, rinse and repeat. And it's all in the name of trickle-down economics, which is perhaps the biggest scam ever perpetrated on the American public. It started with Reagan promising that tax cuts for the rich would eventually trickle down to Americans at the very bottom of the income ladder. And Republicans have continued that lie ever since. But now, Democrats are finally calling that out for what it is, with President Biden overtly naming his approach to dismantle the trickle-down lie Bidenomics. Here's what Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg said when I asked him about what their administration is doing to make sure that the wealthy pay their fair share and benefits go to average Americans. You know, this is all part of a broader economic message that the White House is calling Bidenomics, which is positioned basically as a foil to Reaganomics, which is this prevailing notion for decades now among Republicans that the way to stimulate the economy is for money to trickle down from the rich. Biden's approach is obviously different. It's that funding should go from the bottom up. So why is Biden right, and why is this Republican approach of trickle down wrong?
Well, we know because we've seen the results. Look, this Reaganomics concept, which really dominated not just in Republican circles, but really seduced some Democrats over the last 40 years as well, was the idea that if you just made sure you slash taxes for corporations and the wealthy, you absolutely minimized responsibilities and regulations, the result would be economic growth for everybody. And instead, what you saw, I would argue what you saw very predictably, was a widening income inequality, an economy that worked very well for the wealthiest, but not so much for a lot of other people, or not so much for a lot of other communities, including places in the industrial Midwest, like where I grew up in northern Indiana, that was largely left out of that economic growth. Bidenomics is, as President Biden often says, about growing the economy not from the top down, from the bottom up and from the middle out, having policies that favor work over wealth, having policies that reward what working people contribute. It's why we're so strong in being a pro-union administration. It's why we believe in good public investments like fixing roads and bridges and improving trains and transit and enhancing ports and airports, because we know that when you make those good public investments, good private investment follows. I mean, we've seen hundreds of billions of dollars in private investment, much of it in those good paying manufacturing jobs, just in the last couple of years since President Biden took office. And I think that reflects the fact that, just to be clear, Bidenomics is far from being anti-business. It's actually good for business, but business on terms where working people and the middle class benefit the most. And we're going to keep pursuing that. That's the president's focus. It's how we approach everything from sustainability to transportation. Make sure that it's working in a way that helps working people thrive.
Honestly, the contrast between what the Republicans did with their tax cuts for the rich and what Democrats have done when they were given power could not be more apparent. Democrats passed a historic infrastructure bill whose effects will be felt for decades to come. They ushered in the world's fastest economic recovery with the American Rescue Plan. They passed the CHIPS Act, which has already led to a historic boom in American manufacturing jobs and will reduce our supply chain reliance on China. They oversaw the fastest job growth in U.S. history and record low unemployment. They passed the biggest climate investment in history and allowed Medicare to negotiate lower drug prices. They reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act. They passed the first gun safety legislation in 3 decades. They passed the PACT Act for veterans' health care despite Republican opposition. They oversaw the largest reduction in the deficit in history. They codified marriage equality for same-sex and interracial marriages into federal law to help protect it from the far-right Supreme Court majority. And I can go on, but the point is clear. This is the difference between a party that wants to actually build things and bring America forward and a party that wants to squeeze every last penny out of the middle class to enrich themselves while using culture wars as a wedge to keep themselves relevant. And by the way, we see this same mentality among Republicans when it comes to issues like student loan debt forgiveness. Their own large businesses get massive PPP loans forgiven, while they oppose helping young people afford to even stay afloat without being tied to ever-growing, all-consuming debt. Just to name a few Republicans, Matt Gaetz had $476,000 in PPP loans forgiven, Marjorie Taylor Greene had $180,000 in PPP loans forgiven, Greg Pence had $79,000 in loans forgiven, Vern Buchanan had $2.8 million forgiven, Kevin Hern had over $1 million in PPP loans forgiven, Roger Williams had $1.4 million in PPP loans forgiven, Mike Kelly had $974,000 forgiven, Markwayne Mullen had $988,000 in PPP loans forgiven, Carol Miller had $3.1 million forgiven, Brett Guthrie had $4.3 million in loans forgiven. All of these Republicans had no problem with the government forgiving their own loans, but working class people, well, maybe those people should be focusing on pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. After all, don't forget, the government isn't there to forgive loans for regular people. Here's Biden calling them out while announcing a new plan to circumvent the Supreme Court and make sure that working class young people get the relief they need.
Members of Congress who strongly oppose giving relief to students got hundreds of thousands of dollars themselves in relief, members of Congress, because of the businesses they were able to keep open. Several members of Congress got over $1 million. All those loans were forgiven. You know how much that program cost? $760 billion. My program's too expensive. $360 billion more than I proposed in my student debt relief program. I was trying to provide students with $10,000 to $20,000 in relief. By comparison, the average amount forgiven in the PPP, the pandemic loan program, average amount forgiven was $70,000. Now a kid making $60,000, trying to pay back his bills, asking for $10,000 in relief. Come on, the hypocrisy is stunning.
So look, thank God we have a Democratic president who is willing to call this out when he sees it. Trickle-down economics is a lie that doesn't deserve to be taken seriously. And let's hope that soon enough, it ends up just as irrelevant as Mike Pence's presidential campaign. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to the channel and do your part to help grow the progressive media ecosystem. I don't do sponsorships or paid ads, I won't ask for money, but just subscribing to this channel goes a really long way, and it helps get the message out to more people. The subscribe button is right here on the screen. You can also subscribe to my Spanish language channel, which I made to reach those crucial Spanish-speaking voters. That link is on the screen too. And finally, if you want to listen to my audio podcast, you can follow that link as well. Thanks so much for watching.